Hi, all. Welcome to The Pandemic is a Portal. During these next 40 minutes, we will look back at this past year in order to articulate and clarify what teaching will look like for us in a post pandemic world. This session is not about sharing research or data to try to convince you of what teaching should look like next year. Rather, this session is intended to provide you with the space, time, and support to tap into the expertise and experience of the person who knows your curriculum and students best, you. For all of the uncertainty that still remains, this session is one that chooses to tap into, feed off of, and harness the optimism and excitement that is unique to our profession, an excitement fueled by the time between the end of one school year and the start of the next. Today, we're going to think ahead to next year by figuring out what we want to exploit, what we want to explore, what we want to restart, and what we want to let go of. I'm Zach Cohen, the middle school director at the St. Francis School in Louisville, Kentucky, a non-denominational progressive independent school. I'm also a consultant and blogger for the Core Collaborative, specializing in how students and teachers can learn from their mistakes. If you'd like to connect or follow me, I can be reached at my Twitter handle or via email. The coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture, but the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing can be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Author Arundhati Roy is right to suggest that this moment has the potential to impel change. As powerful a draw as a reversion back to a pre-2020 normal is, there is an equally powerful current pulling us in the direction of progress, a steady drumbeat reminding us to not allow all that was lost and sacrificed this past year to be forgotten. For we know that obsolescence awaits those who fail to respond to changing social cultural contexts. In this sense, it is incumbent upon us all to move society forward. Where Arundhati Roy is a bit off base, though, is the implication that this portal is one that we have yet to walk through, one that is still ahead of us, and one that we have a choice to or to not enter. As educators, the portal for change has long since been in our rearview mirrors. And as I think about the mere day's notice that we had to bring our curriculum online, I certainly never felt as though I had much choice in the matter. Those of us in this session, educators everywhere, are the last group of people who need to be convinced that the pandemic must compel change. We've been living it. So before we go any further in this presentation, with the end of the year finally upon us, let us take a deep breath and acknowledge the incredibly creative, resilience, and hard work that we have all demonstrated this year. It has been a time like no other. We've experienced an enormous amount of stress and strain to adapt to constantly changing contexts amid concerns about our own health and the health of our students. It has been a long and exhausting year, to be sure. It is also one that is understood only by those of us who are in the arena. Since school started up again last fall, I've sought to remind my faculty to give me a C+ effort, to give themselves grace, to put themselves first. Of course, trying to convince my faculty to give anything less than their absolute best proved Sisyphean. There was simply no way that I could keep my teachers from responding to the demands of shifting educational sands. Under normal circumstances, teachers aren't comfortable given a C+ effort. And upon seeing inequities exacerbated and achievement dip in, my faculty was less willing than ever to give anything less than an A effort. My faculty wanted to know that in spite of the way that conditions conspired to create such challenging circumstances for our students, that they remained effective. Teachers sought to upskill, relearn, and reimagine their teaching because they wanted to find creative solutions to outwit and outperform the negative effects of the pandemic. This drive to ensure that students were not negatively impacted by the pandemic resulted in some deeply creative changes to their instruction. And this push for change coming from teachers was not something unique to my school. In fact, educators everywhere have led change initiatives. As John Hattie writes, it is hard to find a single policy from districts that assisted in how to effectively teach during the pandemic. Educators found ways to engage their students, deal with challenges, and manage enormous workloads. In other words, it wasn't academics or administrators who spearheaded or figured out what works, it was teachers. Over time, we've been trained to buy into this top-down innovation model where the research and ideas travel in a unidirectional manner from university labs to classrooms. The thing is, this trickle-down model isn't how change necessarily occurs, and certainly not how change occurred this past year. When innovation takes a bottom-up approach, we recognize that educators play a crucial role in not just applying, but producing and sharing research-based innovations rooted in practice. In other words, big R research isn't some exogenous force, but rather is something driven by our experience, expertise, and experimentation. Discovering best practices is an active rather than passive process. Of course, for all that we've discovered this year, we are also exhausted. Not just because of the intensified schedules and the toll that rapid change takes, but also because we are being told that learning loss is at an all-time high. Our exhaustion stems in part from being told that all the effort we've put in just isn't enough. The thing is, though, this message, which has gained such popularity, doesn't tell the complete story. In fact, the successes of this past year outweigh the failures. The average reading loss when compared to pre-COVID years was a minus 0.08 effect size, an effect size that, according to John Hattie, could be turned around quite simply with some targeted literacy intervention. On average, math scores have remained largely unchanged year over year. In short, it seemed that overblown stories like those on the front page of Time magazine are a bit apocryphal, formed to fit a narrative that will catch attention rather than spread factual information. And consider that even if reading and math loss had been extreme enough to warrant claims of a lost year, these traditional markers of achievement aren't necessarily the most relevant indicators of learning. Students became increasingly self-efficacious and learned crucial self-regulation skills. Consider what we know about the future. Now, consider that no crop of students has been better prepared to take on the rigors of the emerging future. Consider that in just 5 years, much of what we know about the world will no longer be true. The computers of the future will not be digital. Software code itself will begin to disappear. Predictions for 2025 suggest that about 60% of high-paying jobs in America will be able to be done exclusively from home. Time spent on current work tasks will be evenly split between humans and artificial intelligence. And 44% of the skills that employees will need to perform their roles will change every 5 years. According to one expert, the most important skill a young learner can develop right now is the ability to pivot and flourish. Pivot and flourish. Could anything better encapsulate our students' learning from this past year? So, without being Pollyannish, let us appreciate the many successes we experienced this year. And with these successes in mind, let us begin to look ahead to next year. In other words, let's figure out how we too can pivot and flourish. We educators learned a great deal from the disruptions that occurred during this past school year. We updated our toolkits, reimagined learning, and supported students like never before. Now, with the astonishingly rapid rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, many of us want to simply get back to normal, which is understandable. We all want some semblance of predictability to return to our day-to-day lives. However, this past school year surfaced some significant problems with our conception of normal. As the school year comes to a close, we finally have that time to catch our breath and consider what learning should look like moving forward. This session is designed to provide you with the time, space, and support to reflect on this past year, plan ahead to next year, and consider what normal will look like in your classroom from here forward. Our learning objective for today will be at the end of this session, you will have a post pandemic innovation plan. And the agenda for today, we're going to start by talking about when we want to explore and when we want to exploit two complementary but distinct ideas. We're going to talk a little bit about why controllability matters. We're then going to talk a little bit about how our portal matrix will actually work. And finally, we're going to use the remainder of our time to actually get started in this work together. Let's start talking about when to explore and when to exploit. When I first stepped onto a baseball field in college, I knew almost right away that I was out of my depth. I'd come from a small independent school that played against other small independent schools. In this conference, I was able to be effective with nothing more than a four-seamer. Armed with a fastball and really nothing else that merits mentioning, it took about 10 minutes into that first fall practice to recognize that if I wanted to earn playing time, I'd have to develop a secondary pitch. The trouble was that I didn't know how to. I possessed the drive, but not the know-how. At first, I tried to figure it out myself. Like most people, I had some measure of ego caught up in my identity, and I wasn't willing to simply go hat in hand in a teammate for advice. Well, after a fall season when I struggled to get outs, I realized that I really had no other choice. Fortunately, I was surrounded by talented teammates. One of my teammates, a junior who would go on to set multiple school records in both soccer and baseball, had a vicious cutter and a deceptive changeup, and I figured that he was probably the person to learn from. When I approached this teammate after winter practice to ask for his help, he replied with his patented bluster, "What took you so long?" This teammate showed me the grips for his cutter and changeup. Before and after practices that winter, he would throw on a mask and swat 60 feet away from me. He would catch a few pitches, then call out small pointers and corrections. After a winter of work, I went into the spring season armed with a viable secondary pitch, a changeup that the bottom dropped out of. I was never going to be the best pitcher on the team, far from it, I can assure you. But thanks to this peer mentorship, I was able to carve out a place for myself in the bullpen for the next 4 years. This tale is not unique in the world of sports. Athletes sit in dugouts and locker rooms and exchange tips, tricks, and routines. Teams bring veteran players onto rosters every year simply to set an example for the younger players. Across sports and around the globe, athletes recognize and understand the importance of identifying what works and finding ways to exploit it to improve their own performance. Now, there's a lesson to be learned here for educators. In much the same way that no player is ever going to make every shot or hit a home run every at-bat, we know that being the perfect educator is an elusive concept. Rather, we are learners, seeking to always improve our practice. Doing so requires us to strike a balance between two forces in learning: exploration and exploitation. When something we are doing isn't having the desired outcome, we want to explore why this might be, identify resources, and see what we want to modify or change. When something is working, we want to exploit these tactics, generalizing and scaling them to impact learning beyond our classroom. When we pursue exploitation, we are relying on the efficacy of existing knowledge. In contrast, the process of exploration speaks to a search to develop more meaningful knowledge. Back in college, I sought to exploit what had worked for me in high school, but quickly learned that the circumstances called for exploration. In this case, finding a mentor helped me progress. I sought superior solutions to reconcile my knowledge gap and began to integrate this newfound knowledge into my own practice. We all want to engage in both the exploration and exploitation process. All educators have things they can learn from their colleagues. Equally, all educators have things their colleagues can learn from them. As schools, we want to think ahead to next year. As educators, we want to think ahead to next year, and we want to be willing to learn from and share with one another. Our job has to be to figure out what we want to explore and what we want to exploit. Each teacher is going to need to do things a little bit differently, but the first step is looking back and planning ahead is for us to identify what we want to explore and what we want to exploit. Next, let's chat about why controllability matters. Now, we know that there is plenty that is not within our control, but there is also plenty that is. When we focus on those things within our control, we pursue change with conviction. When we resign ourselves to circumstances being entirely out of control, change is rarely pursued and certainly isn't pursued with any degree of alacrity. So, while we do not have control over the spread of a virus, and many of us don't have control over our school or district's policies and protocols, there are still things within our control. These things are called proximal variables, those variables that are within our immediate sphere of influence. Focusing on these proximal variables is a necessary precondition for exploration to occur. I mean, if we don't believe we can improve our practice, one is unlikely to find the motivation needed to explore alternatives to it. This is why a mindset shift that focuses our attention on those things we can control is so important. When I first moved to China, I found myself in a situation where I had to do just this: focus on the controllables, irrespective of how much of the broader picture I actually had no control over. Right after I graduated from college, I accepted a volunteership to teach English in rural China. Mind you, I had never taken a Chinese class before. I had very little knowledge of the culture and even less knowledge of the language. When I arrived, my liaison took me out to show me around the town. It was an especially hot and humid day, so we stopped to grab a Coke in what was basically the equivalent of a bodega. I insisted that I try to communicate with the shopkeeper since I'd soon enough have to do this on my own. Equipped with no language skills whatsoever, I tried to pantomime a drink and gesture and repeat over, Coke, Coke, Coke. After some befuddlement, the shopkeeper indicated that she understood what I meant. She left the counter, went behind a curtain, and when she came back, she had a bowl of small dried fish in her hand. She put this on the countertop and rang me up. In that moment, I realized that I needed to learn Chinese. I went back to my apartment, took a short nap, woke up, and began my learning journey. I took a notebook and a pocket dictionary and headed out into the city of Shanghai. I did the same thing every day for months. I hopped onto a bus at random, rode it until I saw something out the window that caught my attention, got off, and began to speak with people. After a few seconds of conversation, I'd hit a roadblock. There would be something I'd want to communicate that I didn't know how to. I'd make a note of this in my notebook and head home. That night, I'd use the dictionary to learn what I had wanted to say. The next day, I'd venture back out, and each day I was able to speak for a few additional seconds. Each day, during these first few months, I actively sought failure. I intentionally brought myself to the edges of my knowledge and leaped gleefully into that learning pit below. That night, I'd pull myself out of it, only to jump right back in it the following day. In this instance, failure was fun. It was exhilarating. It brought me joy. Mistakes were not something I feared, but rather something that illuminated all that I had left to learn. They were something I pursued. For me, fear was no longer a headwind. It became a tailwind propelling me forward. My failure was an inevitability. What I decided to do was perceive of my failure as something I could control rather than something I couldn't. This made all the difference in my language learning and ultimately my enjoyment over the 2 years that I lived there. Having spoken a bit now about the ideas of exploration, exploitation, and controllability, let's dive into the meat and potatoes of this session, which is the portal matrix. The portal matrix is an instrument to help facilitate a post-crisis innovation plan. In order for us to engage with this matrix, we're going to leave the ASCD platform, since pre-recorded sessions don't exactly lend themselves to a very interactive experience. Before we get there, though, let's walk through the matrix. First, you'll notice the axes. The y-axis runs from stopped to started. The x-axis runs from ineffective to effective. I think started and stopped are comparatively self-explanatory. We are talking about those practices that you started in the past year since the onset of the pandemic, and those things that you did prior to the pandemic but have since stopped. On the other hand, the effective and ineffective scale probably could use a bit of an explanation. Effective is one of those terms that can mean a lot and mean something different to each of us. So let's consider what it means in the context of this exercise. So for here, it can mean a few different things. It can refer to structure. In other words, the systems and design elements that define time and space and other core elements of the classroom experience. It can refer to pedagogy, the method and practice of teaching, the way you define learning in your classroom. It can also refer to culture, the relationships and norms that define the student experience in your classroom. So, ineffective to effective can really be filtered through the lens of any of those three criteria. So, let's go ahead and whip around the quadrant to explain each of them. And we're going to start in that upper right hand corner. So, up there in this quadrant, which is where the intersection exists between started and effective, this is where you will list those things that you will want to exploit moving forward. These are those things that at either a structural, pedagogical, or cultural level are working, and you want to keep the good times rolling. Moving to the upper left-hand corner, this is where you'll list those things you've started but have proven ineffective. Once listed, you'll then make a choice. Do you want to explore these things, tapping into the expertise and experience of your colleagues or your PLN, or is it time to eliminate it? Ultimately, our time is finite, and we don't want to invest it in something that we do not feel will ever be effective. Moving to the lower left-hand corner, this is where you'll list those things that you stopped as a result of how schooling changed during the pandemic, and that you also find to be ineffective. Perhaps this is something you did prior to March 2020 that you now realize you just don't miss. And finally, in that lower right-hand corner, you will list those things that you stopped because of the pandemic, but that you do miss. Those things that once we return to in-person schooling at less than 6 feet apart, you'll want to revive. As for how we will actually interact with this matrix so that we can walk away from today's session with a post-crisis innovation plan, we're going to move to Jamboard. Now, Jamboard will allow us each to write, post, and edit in real time. You'll also be able to return to this Jamboard after this session if you want to continue this work. When you click on the link, you'll find that there are 5 copies of the portal matrix. This will allow us to spread out if it happens that there are many people in the session, which I couldn't tell you right now. It will also allow teams or colleagues to work together if any of you are here representing the same school. If you've never used Jamboard before, all you'll really need to know is that you'll click on the link that I will enter into the chat, not yet, and then add your ideas using either the text box, which is the 7th option down in the toolbox on the left-hand side of the screen, or the sticky note feature, which is the 4th option down. You can even add an image that captures your thinking if you'd like. Now, before I enter the link and before we begin work on the portal matrix, let us discuss the steps that should follow this session, those things that you can actually do to bring your notes to life. Right? Learning journeys can be long with unanticipated hurdles, roadblocks, and setbacks. Rather than map out something in its entirety, which likely won't come to fruition, let's strategize with this simple 3-step plan to get you started. First, let's be targeted. Of all the notes you add, select just one to start. The change process should be exciting, but it shouldn't be overwhelming. Change is an iterative process, and the great innovations that I've seen in classrooms have always been the result of small steps rather than large leaps. Second, consider what your destination looks like. In other words, how will you know you are successful? Well, one way to figure that out is to create a list of sensory criteria. What will you see when you're successful? What will you hear? What will it feel like when this change has been implemented with fidelity? Finally, now that you've selected what to work on, and now that you know what your destination looks like, it's time for you to identify the first step. The toughest part of any change effort is task initiation. By articulating the first step, you are halfway towards towards taking action towards it. Remember, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So you want to articulate what that first step is. So with that, I'm going to enter the link to the Jamboard in the chat. Remember, there are 5 identical Jamboards, so you can space out if you'd like or work collaboratively. Now, let's also keep this ASCD window open so that we can communicate via the chat. If you close out of this window, you will no longer be able to engage with me or your fellow participants. The other window is ultimately just an interactive graphic. It doesn't have a chat feature. All right, guys, let's get to work.